June morning, 1944. Somewhere near Kassel, inside a low-roofed Luftwaffe maintenance hangar, whose corrugated walls still bore shrapnel pocks from the last American raid. A single fighter stood under the hanging lamps, not a Messerschmitt or a Focke-Wulf, but a foreign machine in dull olive drab. Its wings were broad, its fuselage massive, its canopy bulbous and unfamiliar. The mechanics around it moved with quiet reverence and a hint of disbelief. On the cowling, hastily brushed over in yellow paint, the Balkenkreuz stood where a white star had once been. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This was one of the few intact Republic P-47D Thunderbolts ever captured in flyable condition. It had been forced down near Laon, France, barely a week earlier, after a dogfight gone wrong and a long glide on an engine crippled by flak. The pilot had been pulled from the wreck alive and taken to Dulag Luft. His machine, however, was bound for a more exclusive fate. For German engineers and test pilots at the Rechlin and Kassel evaluation centres, such trophies were treasure. Each represented an opportunity to peer directly into the mind of the enemy, to decode not just hardware, but an entire philosophy of war. But on this morning, the focus of attention was not the massive Pratt & Whitney radial engine or the intricate turbo supercharger that dominated the airframe's belly. It was something smaller, perched atop the cockpit's instrument panel, a box of glass and metal, no larger than a field ration tin, with a circular lens that shimmered faintly under the hangar lights. Hauptmann Erich Sommer, a decorated reconnaissance pilot and test officer now assigned to the Luftwaffe's E-Stell evaluation program, leaned closer. The faint outline of a projected circle and cross was visible through the dust-speckled lens. "Das ist kein gewöhnliches Visier," he murmured. "This is no ordinary gun sight." The label on the casing read N9 Reflector Sight U.S. Army Air Forces. It was, to German eyes, both familiar and alien. The Luftwaffe had used reflector sights since the late 1930s Revi 12, later Revi 16 rugged optical devices with mechanical adjustments for range and convergence. But this American sight behaved differently. When Sommer tilted his head, the reticle floated weightless, unmoving, centered as if painted on the horizon itself. He lifted his chin higher. Still, the glowing ring held its place, perfectly stable. He glanced toward the senior engineer beside him, Dr. Wilhelm Funke, an optical specialist from the Zeiss works at Jena. Funke's expression was grave, his notebook already open. "This is gyroscopically stabilized," he said quietly. "It must be." Sommer frowned. "Impossible. A gyroscopic computing sight in a single-seat fighter? It would need servos, sensors, and electricity." Funke finished, which the Americans appear to have in abundance. He adjusted his spectacles and peered through the rear access panel of the gunsight assembly. A network of fine wires and precision-cut gears lay within, glinting under the beam of his flashlight. Sommer straightened. The hangar smelled of oil, hot metal, and the faint sweetness of glycol coolant. Outside, the distant rumble of Allied bombers echoed across the countryside, a reminder that this curious piece of American optics was not merely a scientific puzzle, it was a question of survival. For months now, the veteran aces of the Luftwaffe men like Gerhard Barkhorn, Günther Rahl, and the surviving staff of Jagdgeschwader 26 had watched their kill ratios decline. The sky that had once been theirs by instinct and aggression had turned hostile. The new American formations were harder to surprise, quicker to react, deadlier in gunnery. Reports circulated of Thunderbolt and Mustang pilots scoring accurate bursts even in high G turns, their tracers converging as if guided by intuition or fate. The Luftwaffe's explanations varied: luck, superior numbers, improved training. Yet, as captured film gun camera reels began to reach the Reich Air Ministry, an unsettling pattern emerged. The Americans were not simply shooting more often, they were shooting better, in conditions where ordinary sights should have failed entirely. In the early years of the war, aerial gunnery had been as much art as science. Pilots learned to judge deflection, the angle of lead required to strike a moving target, through practice, instinct, and endless hours at the range. The Rev-12C gunsight projected a fixed illuminated reticle onto a slanted piece of glass, enabling a pilot to line up a target while maintaining a full view of the sky. But it required estimation. The reticle did not move. The pilot had to imagine the point in space where the enemy would be by the time the bullets arrived. To hit a crossing target at 300 km per hour and 200 meters range, a pilot might need to aim several plane lengths ahead, a calculation performed in the mind, under G-forces, while bullets flew in both directions. For an ace like Adolf Galland or Erich Hartmann, that process was almost instinctual. They felt deflection as naturally as others felt balance. But the average pilot, and by 1944, the Luftwaffe was mostly average pilots, struggled. Training hours had dwindled, fuel shortages curtailed flight time, and new recruits were arriving at the front with barely 60 hours in type. Their chances against experienced Allied pilots, equipped with increasingly advanced aircraft, were slim even before technology tilted the scales further. The British had been first to field a functional gyro gunsight, the K-14, developed from the British Ferranti GGS MCAR IIC and later adopted by American forces as the N9 and K-14 Amperes. Its principle was deceptively simple yet revolutionary. Inside the sight, small gyroscopes measured the angular velocity of the aircraft as it turned. A system of servos translated that motion into movement of the illuminated reticle. When the pilot tracked an enemy through a turn, the reticle automatically deflected ahead of the target, predicting where the rounds would go based on turn rate and distance. The only input the pilot provided was the target's wingspan set by a simple dial, and the system did the rest. In effect, the sight transformed deflection shooting from an art into an algorithm, and that, as Funke and Sommer realized that morning in Kassel, was precisely what they were looking at. Funke traced a gloved finger along the sight's base, finding a small rheostat knob marked target wingspan 35 feet. He turned it slowly. The projected circle expanded and contracted in response. His pencil paused mid-note. "They've built the range calculation into the reticle," he said. "A pilot simply dials the target's span, keeps the wings filling the circle, and fires." Sommer shook his head. It cannot be that simple. But simplicity, they were learning, was the essence of Allied design philosophy. Where German engineers pursued mechanical perfection and complexity, tight tolerances, hand-fitted assemblies, the elegance of design for its own sake, the Americans pursued utility. They built machines that worked for the average man, that could be mass-produced, maintained in the field, and mastered in hours rather than weeks. The P-47's gunsight embodied that ethos. It required no special training in ballistics tables, no mental trigonometry at 600 kilometers per hour. It simply worked. By the summer of 1944, the German air war had entered a phase of attrition that no individual skill could reverse. The Allied bombing offensive had reached a scale unimaginable 2 years earlier. In the previous month alone, the 8th Air Force had launched more than 20,000 sorties over occupied Europe and Western Germany. Industrial cities like Schweinfurt, Kiel, and Kassel had been reduced to smoking craters. The Jagdwaffe's response was valiant but futile. Losses mounted faster than replacements could be trained. Technical superiority, once the pride of the Reich's aviation industry, had eroded. The Me-262 jet loomed as a promise but arrived too late and in too few numbers. The day-to-day battle belonged to the piston fighters, the Bf-109G and the FW-190 Amperes now facing American opponents that combined altitude performance, range, and firepower in proportions that defied countermeasure. Amid this collapse, the evaluation units at Rechlin and Kassel became reluctant sanctuaries for surviving intellect. Men like Funke, Sommer, and their British-educated colleague Dr. Otto Guth sought to understand not just what the Allies had built, but why their designs worked so effectively in combat. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That pursuit had already humbled them more than once. They had examined the P-47's turbo supercharger and found an engineering philosophy of abundance systems duplicated for reliability, power delivered through brute force rather than elegant efficiency. They had dissected American radios and discovered mass-produced components that exceeded the quality of German hand-assembled sets. Now, as they dismantled the N9 site, the lesson was turning psychological. For Sommer, who had flown reconnaissance missions over England in 1941 and considered himself one of the Luftwaffe's more technically literate pilots, the idea that a gun sight could think was disturbing. In German doctrine, the man was the weapon. The machine was merely an extension of his will and skill. A sight that performed calculations blurred that hierarchy. Focke, ever the scientist, saw it differently. He recorded the internal layout of the gyroscopic cage, the miniature servo motors, the dampers that prevented oscillation. The precision impressed him, but so did the practicality. "This is not experimental," he noted. "It is production, built to withstand vibration, dust, temperature. Thousands must exist." He was right. By the spring of 1944, American factories were producing gyro gun sights by the tens of thousands. Republic and North American were fitting them to nearly every frontline fighter. The Royal Air Force, after extensive trials, had reported gunnery accuracy improvements of nearly 400% compared to fixed sights. Combat reports confirmed it. Pilots who previously required long bursts to score hits were now downing enemy aircraft with half the ammunition. That single metric accuracy translated into survival. In the days following the Kassel examination, the captured P-47's gun sight was sent to Jena for complete disassembly under Zeiss supervision. Focke accompanied it, filing a detailed memorandum to the Luftwaffe Technical Office. His report, recovered after the war from Allied archives, remains one of the most candid internal assessments of German technological inferiority during the conflict. It opened with a sentence that must have stung those who read it. "The American sight demonstrates a degree of practical computing previously believed unattainable within the space and power constraints of a single-seat fighter." Focke's analysis detailed the use of two miniature gyroscopes operating on orthogonal axes, their precession signals translated through variable resistors to control the reticle's deflection. The system, though conceptually simple, required materials lightweight alloys, high-temperature insulation, stable electrical contacts that German industry could not easily reproduce by 1944. Copper, essential for electrical wiring, was in short supply. Skilled instrument makers were dispersed by bombing or conscripted into military service. Even if a prototype could be constructed, mass production was impossible. Still, the engineers tried. At Rechlin, experimental teams attempted to retrofit the existing Rev-16 gun sight with a crude gyroscopic compensator using scavenged aircraft horizon instruments. The device worked briefly but failed under G-loads. Others proposed a simplified mechanical predictor using linkages rather than servos, but accuracy was poor. The effort consumed precious weeks. Allied fighters did not wait. By late summer, reports from the Western Front told the same story again and again. German pilots outturned and outflown not necessarily by better men, but by better aim. The Americans no longer needed to close to 100 meters to guarantee hits. They could fire from 300, even 400, confident that the reticle's invisible computation would place their bullets precisely. To the Luftwaffe aces who had once prided themselves on marksmanship as the purest expression of combat skill, this realization was devastating. Oberst Günther Röhrl, who survived the war as Germany's third highest scoring ace, later recalled his first encounter with Mustangs equipped with the new sight. "They fired from incredible angles," he said in a post-war interview. "You would see tracers coming not from behind but from the side, and still they hit. It made no sense until we learned about their gun sights." The frontline pilots did not yet know the term gyroscopic computing sight, but they knew its effect. The Americans were no longer guessing. They were calculating, invisibly, in real time. By the time Focke's report reached Berlin in September 1944, The war's industrial geography had already sealed its fate. Zeiss at Jena lay under constant threat from bombing. The optical glass supply chain, once the envy of the world, was collapsing. The Luftwaffe's research budget had been redirected to rocket and jet programs. There was no capacity, nor time, to replicate the American site, even if blueprints could be drawn. Yet within the crumbling walls of the Air Ministry, a few officers recognized the deeper meaning of what they had seen. The Americans had not merely built a better gunsight, they had built a better system. Training, production, logistics, and technology formed a seamless chain that translated industrial power into battlefield precision. The Luftwaffe, once supreme in individual talent, could not match that machinery of war. Funke's final paragraph read like a eulogy. This instrument embodies the industrial principle of the United States, the transformation of complexity into reliability through production. It removes from the pilot the burden of calculation and permits him to fight with confidence. Against such integration of science and manufacture, our present methods are inadequate. Outside Kassel, the night raids intensified. Summer continued test flights in surviving prototypes, but each week the skies grew emptier of German aircraft. The Rev-16 remained the standard sight to the end. Its fixed crosshairs would guide the last desperate sorties of 1945, through smoke, through tracer, through inevitability. Yet, in captured hangars and post-war laboratories, Allied investigators would later find German notebooks filled with sketches of gyroscopes, deflection rings, and servo circuits. Among them, a faint pencil note in Sommer's hand. If we had this in 42, perhaps. He never finished the sentence. Autumn, 1944. The skies above Western Europe were no longer battlefields, they were arenas of survival. For the men of Jagdgeschwader 26, once the Luftwaffe's elite fighter wing, the air had turned from blue freedom to a cage of odds they could not bend. Every sortie began the same way: climb to altitude, find the bombers, and hope the fuel held long enough to return. What had once been duels between equals had become ambushes, and more, the hunters had switched places with the hunted. Lieutenant Karl-Heinz Oehler, a 20-year-old fresh from accelerated flight training, squinted through his Rev-16 gunsight. The plexiglass glared in the sun, the faint orange reticle barely visible as he jinked his 109G-14 into a climbing turn. Somewhere ahead, he had spotted a formation of thunderbolts diving toward their airfield. He rolled right, pulling 4 Gs, trying to get the lead P-47 inches his sights. The big American fighter filled the glass for half a second and then vanished, rolling left in a blur of silver. Oehler fired too late. His tracers arced harmlessly behind, as they always seemed to do. But the American hadn't missed. From a deflection angle so steep it seemed impossible, a burst of .50 caliber fire stitched across the sky, and Oehler's canopy filled with smoke. He bailed out moments before his Messerschmitt turned into a black spiral against the fields below. He would later tell his debriefing officer, "It was as if he knew where I would turn before I turned." The story repeated itself across the front. German pilots, once masters of deflection, shooting, and spatial awareness, were dying in engagements where the Americans seemed to hit with uncanny precision. Combat film confirmed it: footage from Thunderbolt and Mustang gun cameras showing short, decisive bursts. No waste, no guessing, just geometry, solved by gyroscope and light. The Luftwaffe command initially dismissed the reports as exaggeration. "The Americans fire in groups," one colonel scoffed, "and luck must eventually find its mark." But by November, the statistics were undeniable. Luftflotte Reich reported loss ratios climbing to 5-1 against single-engine fighters. Even seasoned aces found themselves overwhelmed. Major Heinz Baer, credited with over 200 victories, later remarked in frustration, "It wasn't that they flew better, it was that they missed less." Back at Rechlin, the Technical Evaluation Center, Funke's reports from Jena had made their way into a hastily convened research directive. The Air Ministry ordered the development of a Gerät 1202, a German analogue to the American computing site. The task fell to Zeiss and Askania, both crippled by shortages and air raids. A test prototype was completed that December, cobbled together from salvaged components of the Kurzkreisel Horizon gyro and the Revi C divided by 12D housing. It was heavy, unstable, and prone to overheating. Test pilot reports were scathing. "The reticle oscillates like a drunk compass," one wrote. Another called it a technical curiosity, not a combat instrument. Focke himself knew it was too late. He had seen what Allied factories could achieve when purpose met production. Germany, by contrast, was now a patchwork of improvisations, brilliant minds fighting physics with solder and hope. Still, he continued his notes, he was a scientist, and to him even defeat had data. Meanwhile, on the Western Front, the Gunsights' invisible influence was rewriting the psychology of aerial combat. In pre-war Luftwaffe doctrine, success in air combat rested on Überlegenheit des Geistes, superiority of spirit. Pilots were trained to think of themselves as artists of motion, sculpting victory through instinct and experience. Machines could assist, but never replace. The pilot's mind, but the Americans had shifted the balance. The N9 and later the K-14 sight replaced intuition with computation. A young pilot, perhaps with a few dozen hours in combat, could now match or even surpass the marksmanship of veterans who had spent years mastering the art. This democratization of lethality unnerved the Luftwaffe's old guard. During a late 1944 debriefing at Akma Airfield, Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, already weary and burned from months of relentless sorties, spoke bluntly to his squadron. "Our skill was our shield. Now, their machine is theirs. We fight not men but mathematics." His words were met with silence. Because everyone knew mathematics doesn't miss. By this time, even the Allies understood what advantage they held. In a report from the 56th Fighter Group, P-47 pilot Francis Gabi Gabreski wrote, "Once the K-14 came in, everything changed. You could haul the stick, hold the pipper on him, and just fire. No more guessing. It felt like cheating, but it worked." Pilots who had once relied on Kentucky windage and instinctive shooting suddenly found themselves hitting targets at ranges they'd never attempted before. The gunnery training programs were rewritten. Squadrons that had once celebrated a 10% hit rate in training were now averaging 40%. And somewhere in a darkened hangar in Germany, Dr. Funke's notes lay beside the disassembled fragments of a captured gunsight, an artifact of a war already lost in the mind before it ended on the ground. December 1944. The Ardennes offensive had begun. Low clouds and winter fog gave the Luftwaffe one last opportunity. The Americans, grounded by weather, were vulnerable. For a few days the sky turned grey and equal again. Jagdgeschwader 11 and 26 launched a daring low-level attack on Allied airfields Operation Bodenplatte, meant to cripple their air power in one decisive strike. It was, in spirit, a return to the old way: surprise, aggression, and skill. But even as hundreds of German fighters streaked across the treetops on New Year's morning, 1,945, many were shot down before they reached their targets. The fog had thinned just enough for radar and ground controllers to vector American patrols into interception. When visibility cleared, the gyro gunsights did the rest. Over Asch Airfield, the 366th Fighter Group scrambled their P-47 seconds within minutes. American pilots, many of them with fewer than 100 hours in combat, tore through the attacking WW 190 seconds and BF 109 seconds. Gun camera film from that day shows the luminous ring of the K-14 sliding effortlessly over retreating German aircraft and bursts lasting less than a second. 80 German aircraft failed to return. For many Luftwaffe survivors, Bodenplatte was the final illusion shattered. No amount of bravery could offset technology that erased human error. In the months that followed, as Allied forces crossed the Rhine and bombers reduced the last industrial centres, the work at Rechlin ceased. Focke was ordered to evacuate Jana's research archives westward before the Soviets arrived. He packed what he could: sketches of reticle projectors, notes on gyro drift compensation, and a single cracked lens from the captured P-47 gunsight. He never saw summer again. The test pilot was killed during a ferry flight in February 1945, his WU-190's engine failing over the Harz Mountains. When American troops entered Jena in April, they found Zeiss technicians still cataloguing optical instruments in the basement. Among them was Funke, pale, exhausted, but eager to speak. The Americans treated him with respect, after all. The scientists of Zeiss were among the few Germans whose expertise might serve reconstruction. One American technical officer, Major Robert Glass, later recalled, "He showed us the pieces of our own gunsight, labelled neatly in German. He said, 'This device ended our confidence.' I thought that was the most honest statement I heard in Germany. Post-war interrogations and captured documents confirmed it. The Luftwaffe had never succeeded in fielding a true gyro gunsight of its own. Their last attempt, the EZ-42, reached limited frontline use only in the spring of 1945, too late to matter. Ironically, the EZ-42's design drew directly from principles first observed in the captured American N-9. But where the Allies had built theirs for mass production, the German version required meticulous calibration, delicate assembly, and hand-tuned gyros. Pilots complained it was heavy, temperamental, and impossible to maintain in the field. In one preserved combat report from Jagdgeschwader 53, an unnamed pilot wrote simply, "We have the sight, but not the war to use it in." By war's end, the lesson had crystallized. The battle between the P-47's gunsight and the Revi was not merely about optics, it was about philosophy. Germany's engineers had built wonders of precision, but in doing so, they had tied themselves to craft and scarcity. The Allies had built systems ugly, rugged, and standardized that could flood the battlefield by the thousand. And behind those systems stood a concept that the Luftwaffe never truly grasped until it was too late. Accessibility is power. 1,000 average pilots with good machines will always beat 100 aces with perfect ones. When the war ended, Funke was recruited under Operation Paperclip, not for rocketry, but for optics. He spent several years advising on early jet gunsight systems, quietly integrating what he had learned from both sides. He would later tell an interviewer in the 1960 seconds, "In that gunsight, I saw the future, a pilot guided by machine, and a machine guided by numbers. It frightened me then. It still does. And perhaps that fear was not misplaced. The same logic that guided the reticle of the N-9 would, within a decade, guide missiles, radars, and computers. The pilot's intuition, once the soul of air combat, would yield, bit by bit, to circuitry. But in 1944, for the men in the skies over Europe, that transition was not abstract. It was visible, glowing, and deadly, a small circle of light in the middle of the gunsight that seemed to know where you were going before you did. The war was over. But the circle remained. In laboratories from Dayton to Farnborough, engineers dismantled what the Luftwaffe had feared, not the American gunsight itself, but the idea behind it. The glowing ring that had once guided bullets now became the blueprint for a new relationship between human and machine. For the first time, pilots had trusted a device to think faster than they could. The N-9 and K-14 sights had marked a quiet turning point. Intuition replaced by computation, emotion replaced by data. It was a revolution not of steel, but of logic. When American engineers analyzed the captured German EZ-42, they saw refinement without reach, brilliance confined by scarcity. It was heavier, fragile, demanding of maintenance. The US sight, by contrast, could be produced by the thousands and bolted into aircraft by workers who had never flown. That difference, more than any battle, defined the outcome of modern war: scale over perfection. In the late 1940 seconds, the descendants of those gun sights began to evolve. The Ione centimeter computing sight, developed for jet fighters like the F-86 Sabre, directly inherited the principles born inside the P-47's cockpit. Its gyros were smaller, its corrections faster, its logic sharper. The pilot's task was now almost philosophical: to trust the machine, to surrender the old pride of instinct. Korean War pilots found themselves living proof of that transition. Against nimble MiG-15 seconds flown by seasoned veterans, American Sabre pilots relied on their radar-assisted gunsights, leading targets through clouds and contrails they could barely see. One pilot wrote, "You don't fire at the airplane anymore. You fire at the mathematics of where it will be." The phrase could have been Funke's epitaph. In post-war Germany, he walked the ruins of Jena Zeiss factory and saw the ghosts of precision that had once defined his world. Yet even he understood what the future demanded: instruments that removed guesswork, that transformed man from artist into operator. He would later say in a lecture to young engineers in 1953, "The pilot of the future will not aim, he will decide. The machine will aim for him." It was prophetic. Within a decade, the illuminated circle of the N9 had become the head-up display, projected directly onto a pilot's windscreen. The circle that once guided bullets would now guide aircraft, missiles, even spacecraft. The same optical principle that let a Thunderbolt pilot see through his gunsight would let Apollo astronauts align their trajectory to the stars. The war's smallest device had, quietly, become civilization's compass. But technology always leaves a shadow. For the men who survived the Luftwaffe, the memory of that glowing reticle carried more than defeat, it carried humility. Johannes Steinhoff, one of the last wartime commanders, visited the United States in the 1960 seconds and toured an Air Force base. In a flight simulator, he saw the modern descendant of the gunsight he had once studied at Kassel. The display was digital, the reticle dynamic. The instructor asked if he wanted to try it. Steinhoff looked through the screen, smiled faintly, and said, "Now I see what we were fighting, not the pilot, but the future." Historians often summarize the Luftwaffe's downfall in numbers: fuel shortages, overwhelming odds, pilot attrition. Yet those who look closer understand it was also a collapse of philosophy. The Germans had believed war rewarded mastery. The Americans discovered it rewarded systems. The gunsight was the smallest embodiment of that truth. It didn't just improve aim, it redefined it. The circle no longer represented the target. It represented trust in industry, in abstraction, in the invisible calculations of physics that no human could see but all would obey. The same logic would later guide missile locks, computer fire control, and the digital symbology of modern combat. The pilot became a decision-maker, surrounded by algorithms descended from that same 1944 lens. The battle of intuition versus computation had ended, and the numbers had won. In museums today, the P-47's N9 gunsight sits behind glass, small, unassuming, its optics dulled by time. Children walk past without pausing, unaware that this device once frightened an empire. Across the room, the German Revi 16 stands proudly, all brass and glass, its craftsmanship undeniable. Yet beside them, the plaque tells the quiet truth. The gyroscopic sight represented the moment when machines began to share the burden of judgment. It is not a sentence about technology. It is about surrender, the necessary surrender that progress demands. The circle has since become universal. In fighter jets, it floats on digital helmets. In drones, it appears on control screens thousands of miles from battle. Even in video games, it is still there, the reticle, the glowing promise that the machine will calculate what we cannot. We no longer notice it. But in 1944, for the first time, men looked into that light and saw the beginning of a new kind of war, one fought not with courage or instinct, but with information. That was the true revelation the Luftwaffe aces faced when they examined the captured P-47 gunsight. They weren't just seeing a piece of Allied engineering. They were seeing the blueprint of the world to come, a world where human skill would always share its seat with computation. Funke's final surviving note, preserved in a post-war archive, reads simply, "A perfect circle, not of victory, but of inevitability. And perhaps that is the most fitting legacy of all. The same luminous ring that once hovered in a gunsight has never truly disappeared. It still watches from every cockpit, every display, every calculation we trust to be right. It began as a tool of war. It remains a mirror reminding us that every advance in precision carries the same old question. Who aims the man or the machine? The circle that once shimmered in a P-47 cockpit never truly vanished. It drifted from gunsight to radar scope, from helmet visor to satellite, display a ghost of the moment when humanity first trusted a machine to think for it. For the Luftwaffe engineers who once stared into its glow, it was a revelation and a reckoning. They had built their war on mastery, on the idea that victory belonged to the better pilot, the sharper eye. But the circle whispered something new, that in the future, the winner would be the one who built the better system. Decades later, that same glowing reticle lives on not just in the cockpits of modern fighters, but in every screen that quietly predicts, assists, or corrects our actions. The principle born in war became the foundation of a world ruled by guidance and computation. What began as a device to aim bullets ended as a lesson in trust, the first handshake between human intuition and machine intelligence. And in that small, perfect circle of light, the 20th century saw its reflection not just of where it aimed, but of where it was inevitably heading. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.